so much, Molly, Dennis, and David, and Dynamics Con team, as well as those who voted for my session and giving me an opportunity to talk. It is really great to see all of you taking the time to be here, and it's really honor to have a chance to spend some time with you. So hi everyone, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending upon from wherever you are joining in. So let me get started a little bit about me. So my name is Rakesh Darge. I am the lead of Center of Excellence for Dynamics 365 Finance and Supply Chain Management and Senior Solution Architect at Tata Consulting Services in Mumbai, India. I grew up in the IT. I have been working with Microsoft Stack all of my professional careers. Got my start working in VC++ and then Visual Basic way back before I moved into the ERP space in 2009, and later I moved to Dynamics 365 FNO world, and earlier it was known as Dynamics X, that is back in 2005. For the past 15 years out of 20, I have been focused just on the Dynamics 365 FNO space. So at the Center of Excellence, my team and I are responsible for guiding customer through their digital transformation journey, as well as helping them to modernize their legacy applications into this modular cloud ERP, that is Dynamics 365 FNO. I'm also team lead and founder of India Dynamics 365 Power Platform User Group, registered in community.dynamics.com. You can always reach out to me through this LinkedIn and Twitter, which I captured in this my presentation deck. In terms of the work experience, I have been working throughout almost all the versions of Dynamics AX, right from AX 3.0. I lived in India and I almost work in almost all the geographies, right from UK, US, Europe, and some sort of part of the Gulf as well. In terms of the certifications, recently I've been awarded as Microsoft Certified Trainer for Dynamics 365 FNO, as well as certified in Solution Architect in FNO as well as in Azure, both. So one of the things I help customers with integration strategy and design, and that is where our today's topic as well. So in terms of today's agenda, to be honest with you, I'm really excited to take you through our agenda today. So agenda for this session, we are going to talk about a really interesting topic. What is integrations? Often we have seen the integration is there everywhere when you try to implement the Dynamics 365 finance or supply chain management apps, but really the question comes into mind: what is integration in ERP? Okay, and why these integrations strategies are required when there is a lot of platforms capabilities are available in the Azure Power Platform as well as the other third-party tools, and then how the customers are going to leverage key component strategies of the integrations. We will also touch base a couple of points on what are the factors to be considered when someone is choosing the integration strategies for the implementations. And then I want to dig in a little bit deeper and talk about each part of the strategies for integrations, which will be helpful while designing the solution for Dynamics 365 FNO with Azure Integration Services, as well as I think it is known as AIS as acronym. In terms of understanding, I'm going to walk you through typical business use cases and how you should address those with the help of the key component of integration strategies, as well as factors to consider. And I'm sure Dennis mentioned this already, right? But if you do have any questions, please enter those into in the chat window, and I will try to pause from time to time and answers those. Now let us move on to next slide, and before I deep dive into subsequent slide, I would like to set context here, and which I would like to share a few acronyms which I frequently use during our presentation today. The way the product name is evolving, right? Most of the times we call as FNO, or a specific module of Dynamics 365 Finance or Supply Chain Management, or other Dynamics 365 ERP. Sometimes we also call it as a Finance and Operations. However, there are other key attributes which is very specific to the architecture jargons, I would say. ESB, that is Enterprise Service Bus, so on and so forth, right? So just keeping in mind while I'm navigating all my subsequent slides, probably I'll try to use this acronym frequently. So let us move on to our next slide. So when we think about the integration in Dynamics 365 FNO, the key to ensuring a great integration is all about thinking about data, you know, and data is center for everything. And I believe, with the help of integration strategies, the guiding principles that has been shaped by the product and the Azure as a platform, with Dynamics 365 FNO, you will significantly achieve your implementation goal, right? So with that, let us deep dive more on the the next slide, which is why integration strategies are required, right? And I'm sure you must have gone through these questions when you were trying to you know implement the solutions and having a dialogue with your customers, right? As I'm also connecting with the customer as part of this implementation journey, most of the times I come across these sort of six big questions, right? And the first one is, what does this end-to-end integration landscape look like, right? We have been witness to this unbelievable shift in this integration stack and the technology that has been currently with us as a platform of Dynamics 365 FNO, and it has been still evolving stage. And in the past couple of months, if not in years, we have seen a tremendous opportunity as well as the options that has been part of these solutions, as it is fulfilling the customer integrations need, whether it is in manufacturing, financial sectors, banking, retail, and consumer product good. Conventionally, ERP integrations, were more complex in nature, not fully because of the complexity of the business processes, but the supported tooling or correct strategies and the best practices around. As the ERP is the center for finance and supply chain management process, therefore more and more data synchronization activities happening in real time, or rather near to real time, right? More between the source and the target system, and thereby it is very very important to define the correct integration strategy. And if you ask me, in my experience, integration strategies really help to reduce the complexities and helps customers to build end-to-end integration landscape more robust. The next question is, what does the error handling and the telemetry capability look like, right? I don't know about you, but I talk to a customers, and more than 20 to 30% efforts goes into define the error handling and the telemetry capability of integration stack. If there is a third party tool, often I have seen the assessments happens to understand what level of error handling mechanism that product offers, and sort of telemetry, so that team or the admin team can deep dive more and understand. As more and more integration systems are involved, it is very difficult, most of the times, for admin to understand the failure patterns, whether the failure is at source end or at target end. So I'll give you one example probably that would help to understand the purpose behind of this strategy, right? So for example, orders are getting recorded in a different systems, and fulfillment is happening in Dynamics 365 FNO or a supply chain management app, and the shipment is also managing through another locations. However, the manager who is responsible for that delivery is not able to complete the process due to the orders are not being received on time, or maybe for some valid reason it failed at a receiving end, and nobody is able to diagnose, and nobody is having any clue. And then he tried to communicate to the admin that, hey, this is what the issue is, can you help me to understand, and team started digging out more into a issue, but the lack of error handling mechanism, and team could not able to figure out what went wrong in the integration stack. Eventually business is suffering, and the lead time is increasing, it's not matching with time to market strategy, and so on and so forth, right? So that's the reason it is very important to have the integration strategy defined at the beginning of the implementation journey. Then the next is, how do we build a more resilience integration path for upcoming changes or other releases, right? So integration has become more robust and versatile with the evolution of ERP system, right? And we all are witness since the beginning of this product, right? And it is important for fully understand the requirements for each integration point, or rather you can call it the integration touch points, and then define the integration strategy, especially when you think about having a minimal changes when the business is asking to accommodate new change to be part of the existing integration landscape. And when it comes to involvement of the activity, it includes right from understanding of integration requirements, whether it's a functional, non-functional requirements, until the changes are moved to the production system of FNO, isn't it so? The next question is how are vendors, that is the third party applications, are going to connect securely to our system, right? Which is the Dynamics 365 FNO. As the data is center for every business transactions, it is critical to define the strategy to secure data during the transit, as well as the secret key sort of concepts to store the key at a secure location. The next is how do we maintain the track changes of integrations and accommodate business need with less reworks when there is a change to be happen in that particular integration touch points, and that's the business process is the mission critical business process. Often we have seen the managing the change of integration such as schema, then the business logic, etc. It is so important when there is a complexity of integration touch points are involved. In fact, as you keep changing the same integration touch point multiple times for some valid reasons, because there is a demand from business and there is a change to be evolved. Why? Because the underneath business processes or downstream, upstream business processes need that change to be happen. Most of the times it is the difficult to keep a track of the changes if there is no proper versioning of that change, and that's the reason it's difficult to manage the control that support team which actually managing that activity for the deployment and all. And lastly is accelerating the deployment and testing process of integrations. So how do we accelerate deployment and testing of integration across the environment? Again, time to market, because business is expecting that change to be deployed immediately so that a third party or any other legacy application can accommodate change immediately, and there is minimum impact on the business revenue and the growth, right? So, and this is really an important point for Dynamics 365 implementation, especially in the large scale implementation when there is a complexity of integration systems are involved, and how the customer performs end-to-end integration testing and deployment across the environment. So think about a scenario where you have done some changes in the sales order, outbound integration logic basically, and you are trying to complete the testing and deployment activity across the environment. So think about a scenario, you have a dev machine, you have a SIT, UAT, and some sort of testing environment for the performance the thing, and then the pre-prod across the all environments and including the productions. You can literally stress to complete the testing on time, due to the lengthy process. So in a nutshell, how do you accelerating deployment and testing process, right? So that is what is this last question. So these are some of the big questions, hearing from customers at top of mind for them. Okay, so let us move ahead and talk about a key component of integration strategies for Dynamics 365 finance and operation. So basically integration strategy provides the guidance, rather the guiding principles, hands-on guide to the consultants and the architect. And why it is important in the area of Dynamics 365 integration, because when you design your integration, usually you start gathering the business requirements and trying to understand the characteristics based on the characteristics that you want to pick the right strategy to satisfy the requirement which business is looking for with this platform. And of course being aware of the integration strategy is very useful way to speed up the process, standard way of approach, and also way of improving the quality and what you do on an average. So therefore there might be the unique case where your strategy is probably not applied completely, which is also a standard. That is what my experience says. So let us talk about integration strategy, and particularly when you think about integration at a larger context, you should with the dynamic FNO, and because FNO is not only system, right? In the entire ecosystem, there could be other applications, as I mentioned earlier, legacy or third-party apps, and typically there will be a multiple system involved. Otherwise, you would not, actually really do anything, isn't it? So let us see one by one all these components, and let's focus more on the each and every aspect, understand the nitty-gritty of each and every. So let us understand one by one. So one of them is the direct using web services. You may call it as a SOA, which is nothing but direct web service call, right? So typically, what that implies is is a synchronous call to using the web services technology or a protocol like SOAP. And in this strategy, there is a direct connection with target system, right? So there is nothing wrong in it, but when you think about more complex integration scenario where you have multiple endpoints are involved, and those endpoints are talking to each other, so typically it is a good idea to use a middleware in this context or in this use case, and that is where other strategies comes into picture for a discussion. So you don't have to each endpoint talking to each other endpoints, and might be end up with different connections like n square sort of thing, and that gets spaghetti type of situation, which most of the times may be difficult to resolve any sort of particular issue when it happens in that complex integration strategy, right? But when you have a middleware, then obviously it is n plus 1 endpoints involved, and middleware is having separate endpoint for each of the other endpoints for the communications, and it is a lot better than the direct web service call to the target system. Next component of strategy is message queue. I think everybody probably is aware of this, and it is an asynchronous communication through queue managers and something like conventionally used as a MSMQ. Then there is a message broker which provides routing and transformation with guaranteed delivery. So you can use a different communication protocols and technologies, right? Often it is used for external B2B and the internal integrations EAI, like other cloud or on-premises system in your ecosystem, and often as well you have multiple customers or consumers providers of a data, and then send to a messages brokers, and maybe another subscribes to it, some sort of complexity involved, and endpoint sending messages to first place, and therefore it does not require to define multiple endpoints. It is simply sending a message, and interested subscribers are able to pick that up. So if you have a message broker, is a good example is a logic app. Then let us move on to next component, which is service bus. So service bus as the same set of ideas of a message broker, but it supports for web service technology, including discovery mechanism and ability to deal with metadata management for those services. The next one is business process automation, or BPA or BPM. Then in this case, business process automation is end-to-end automation of a process applications across multiple systems, and the unique fact is that there are long-running business processes, and in addition to this, it is typically involve the real-time monitoring of business processes and rules management in your business process automations. And finally, the entity synchronization and service applications. So basically, it is consolidated view of enterprise-wide business entity, including synchronous update or a consumption by different applications across the multiple applications, such as exposing of virtual entity or concept like that. It is a strategy of entity synchronization. Now let us deep dive and understand the key factors to consider when choosing the integration strategy. So this is about the characteristics we discussed earlier, a sort of information you need to understand in order to select the right integration strategy. However, due to time constraint, I will not go into detail of this slide, and it is comprehensive things. Say for example, latency, right? In other words, it is synchronous integrations where immediate response is required, and that will be typically driven by your business requirements, or Alternatively, it can be also the asynchronous integration, where you are triggering an integrations and you either don't require response at all, or only require delayed response, or require a response after your call was made successfully, and that works will be done potentially with a later call to establish status of that works. And then within the category of asynchronous, okay, that is also important point. Latency, you may categorize that between near real time, in other words, where latency is minimal. Typically, we might think of near real time is less than a minute being allowed, being allowed a trigger between the transmission of the results. And schedule batch is, it is the integration occurring on a schedule basis, where there is a predetermined recurrence or a predetermined intervals between those executions. The next important factor is message routing. In other words, it is point to point integrations, something like ESB, enterprise service bus, such as BizTalk and etc. Or is it more of a hub and spoke mechanism, or some kind of a message broker? Or for example, when you are talking about data migration type typical patterns, extract, transform and load sort of operations, or extract, load, transformation operation. That was the sort of things that provided by Azure Data Factory. Then one of the most important thing that you need to understand about your integration requirement is frequency. In other words, how often will this be call made, and you could satisfy that. Ideally, you could specify that as a hard number, but failing that, in an interval or initial survey of the requirement, you may need to send these details that into a high, medium and low sort of category, where high could be a second or minutes, or medium could be hours and day, or low could be weeks or even months for long running transaction across systems. Another thing is the trigger. In other words, what prompts the execution of this integration? Is that something that is on demand or manual, or is it in manually initiated either by end user or by someone, or someone has like an IT person, or is triggered by an event? Obviously, a perfect example of that is in the context of, again, Dynamics 365 is the business events. In other words, something happens in a software, and as a result of that, and message is sent, and from source to destination system. So that is how it is, the business events, one of the component. Alternatively, an event could be an receipt of such message, or finally trigger could be that it is scheduled on the basis of time and date. So continuing with these factors to be considered, what kind of operation it is. Is it a create, read, update, delete of a particular target entity? It is an action basically. So something like calculated sales order price, right? Or it's sort of important to classify your needs into those sort of operations. So you may have a single integrations handling multiple different operations, and you need to understand what those operations are to design your interface correctly. Next one is the batching characteristics. In other words, if there are multiple pieces of data into a messages, or a multiple requests that are sent together, and those needs to be in a one batch to individual records are sent an integration request, or they batch together with multiple requests in a single protocol message. Then just as an example, the important about the frequency is the volume. In other words, the number of records per batch request. Again, you could be specific about numbers, or you could start by classifying them low, medium, high, and that can do a help you inform your strategy. So for example, high volume, you probably would not want to choose a synchronous mechanism, and you would probably want to choose a mechanism that that allows some sort of parallelism or parallelizations of the processing. Then we'll move on to next one, which is the file format. So the file format and the schema or that particular data dictionary or something like the flat file or XML file, and this is actually, I guess, a sort of talked this already in the previous slide, that but I'm trying to message the API schema. For example, the web services definition language for a subquery or open API, for maybe formally known as swaggers, as a standard way of describing the RESTful JSON services. Also try to see then data mapping, right? The metadata definition. For example, if you have a couple of endpoints and you need to pick, and unless there is happen to be essentially identical endpoints, there will tend to be some sort of schema translations between them, and you can do that in one of the endpoints or other endpoints in some kind of middleware, which you could also consider an endpoint in this context. And then of course it may be useful to, instead of adopting the schema of either endpoints, to define a canonical format into a both, which endpoints need to translate in their directions, and that tend to be more useful as the number of interested parties in an integration or for integrations messaging grows. The canonical formats can be really useful, a way of defining what is required to meet the need of all the required different endpoints, translation or rather transformation and translation points. In other words, where you are doing some kind of a transformation of the message formats, where does it occur, or maybe is it is it in the broker, is it in the source of the destination. Then let us move on to next component, which is error handling and reconciliation, which is also very important. In other words, there are some kind of a user's interface which gets triggered based on the success or failure status of the call. For example, if integration fails, or do you have some kind of a console which brokers of all those kind of messages, and give you one place to manage it for multiple different integrations, multiple different endpoints, and then you recon the reconciliations types of scenario, right? In other words, you are moving that your message was correctly received and processed. So all of these are not even necessarily functional requirements, but not these non-functional requirements, right? So like these can be critical factors in choosing the right strategy for your integration. Let us move on to the next slide, which talks about the integration technology that are currently exist in the FNO world. So as you can read this slide from your left to right, so there are three major buckets. One is the real-time integration or synchronous integration, and the other one is the asynchronous integration. So when it comes to a real-time integrations, it is required or exchange the data to be asynchronous mode, invoke actions via services. So immediately when someone triggers, maybe automatically or manually, the data needs to be synchronized immediately and in a real-time fashion, right? And the couple of guiding principles in the consideration of real-time integration is keep the payload and the business logic small enough to complete the call in less than 1 second for a high latency, or no more than 5 to 10 seconds, right? It comes with by default implies the tight coupling because of the because of the synchronous integration patterns. For example, mobile application or maybe editing the data in the Excel. These are the three technology stack that product offers at this stage. One is the REST API by using the OData v4, and the custom services, JSON based custom services, and the dual write as a platform. The other bucket is, as I mentioned earlier, is asynchronous integrations, which is nothing but a periodic sort of activity or unattended exchange of data with external systems. So think about a scenario, you have scheduled a batch to be triggered automatically maybe during after the office hours, and then the activities to be happen in unattended mode. And the best choice for this particular pattern is your high volume of transactions, so there will be less activities happening in the applications and optimum utilization of resources that has been required for that batch process or high volume data to be processed. Again, it can be a near real time if you look at from that perspective, but it is a loose coupling of a system, so where both the systems are not tightly coupled. Example, maybe exporting of your general ledger summary or some sort of data, large volume of transaction that you are synchronizing with your third party or any other legacy applications. For this particular category, you can leverage data management's recurring and package API sort of thing, which comes with the product and DIX support that, and the business events. Now I'll quickly move on to the deep dive strategy by strategy. So there are 6 strategies that I try to list down for you to understand. Until now, we understood the overall need of why strategies are required, what are those components part of those strategies of integration when you design your solution for F&O. We also talked about factors to consider when you choosing the integrations, the strategies. We also deep dive each and every component, or rather factors, in which scenario that you should go for ESB sort of thing, in which scenario you should go for some sort of options of file-based integration, what can be offered as part of your business need, high volume, medium or low sort of data. And then we also talked about the triggering mechanism in the context of business events. So this is the first strategy what we understood, and based on the strategy, the scenario number or a use case number 1, which is O database integrations. As you can see in this slide deck, it's a bi-directional, which try to synchronize data from your external system. The create, update and delete operations have been part of the synchronization of integration touch points happening with F&O. The REST API using the OData has been exposed, and read mechanisms happening. So as you can see here, the key learning with this strategy is the mode. It's a synchronous mode when you are having a O database integrations, unidirectional or a bidirectional. The message routing is point to point. That is also one of the strategies which I talked about in the previous slide. The frequency of this is hourly. Again, this is based on the need or based on the expectation of your implementation from a customer side. Trigger is happening from your external system. The volume is pretty medium, but the data mapping, as you can see here, is not the canonical model, right? It's a non-canonical options that we have selected, and error handling is rather the reconciliation is managing through the external system. Then we will quickly move on to use case number 2, where you can also leverage the logic apps for your file-based integration, which I try to depict the view. As you can read this slide from your left to right, okay, you can see the external system which is part of your on-premises and trying to integrate with the cloud components. There is SFTP locations where the XML file is being placed. The broker, which is logic app, is trying to read and update the information and send that file data to the F&O using the REST API, and basically it's an asynchronous call. The routing message mechanism is a broker. It's been frequently the frequency is the hourly, and the trigger is also scheduled automatically. It's happening, and the volume is medium. However, the data mapping, as you can see in this use case, is non-canonical, and the error handling mechanism is managed by 3 part of this end-to-end architecture. The one is the logic app, which is a broker. The other one is inside the F&O using the data management framework, if at all, if any failure happens at F&O end, and the external system, where while invoking that process something went wrong in the external system, so external system is also tracking that error handling so that there will be end-to-end traceability of that particular message which is being triggered from external system to Dynamics 365 F&O. Then we'll deep dive more into the next strategy, which is logic app file base with service bus. You might have seen and understood the previous context which I was trying to highlight. in a typical scenario. This is a scenario where your external system is part of your on-premises, as well as your SFTP location is also not in cloud, is in your on-premises. In that case, you could leverage the ESB, which is Enterprise Service Bus component, which is a Azure Service Bus, which will allow you to read that file and then that message sends to broker, and brokers push it to FNO. However, this mode indicates asynchronous mechanism of this process end to end. It's being routing through, as I mentioned earlier, through broker and the ESB. The frequency is set up as hourly, and the trigger is happening on a schedule basis. Again, in terms of data mapping, here what we can see here, the data mapping is non-canonical mode, and then the error handling has been managed across all the platforms, like right from your logic app, then the DI except within the FNO, if at all, if there are any failures happens, then the external system who is already taking care of when the trigger is being initiated from external system, and then the service bus in case any messages fail for some valid reasons. So that is how you can design the architecture, if at all, if there is a specific use case very similar to this. Then we'll move on to next slide where we will talk about use case number 4, where a lot of complexity is involved in terms of middleware across on-premises and cloud, and what best we can leverage as a platform, right? And what is the key design considerations, what we just learned in the previous slide in terms of strategy, in terms of options. So as you can see here, in the on-premises world, we do have an external system which is being connected to the middleware, which is the ESB, which is running on-premises system, and then it's been connected to the SFTP location, which is sitting in a cloud, and the logic in between, which is playing a role of broker, and logic has been connected to on-premises middleware with the help of the application gateway, and messages are being synchronized across the external systems to FNO. However, if you can see here, the mode of this particular message is asynchronous or rather asynchronous. You can see here the way it has been depicted in the slide, and the way it has been highlighted, how that architecture should look like. In terms of the message routing, as you can see here, it's a broker ESB who is taking care of that message routing activity. Frequency has been set up as hourly, and trigger is also happening on a schedule basis. However, the data mapping, because of this complexity involved into a broker and then the middleware, which is already well established in the on-premises world, then the data mapping is being considered as a guided principles for the canonical model. So there will be uniformity in the data field mapping across both the platforms. In terms of the error handling and the reconciliation, as you can see here, if the message failed at a broker level, then logic app is configured in such a way that it is capturing the messages of that particular handling for further investigation or the reconciliation. Then the external system who is triggering that message based on the particular aspect of that business process, and in case if next level of failure happen within the middleware component which is running in on-premises, in this case BizTalk or a web method, or for that matter Dell Bhumi, then you can also record that message. So in a nutshell, what we are trying to achieve here, we are trying to understand the complexity of this solution, and with that complexity, if there are more than 2 middleware components are involved, what best we can leverage out of each and every capability, right from on-premises world and the cloud world. Now we are reaching towards the next strategy, rather the deep dive of one of the strategy which we talked about in the previous slide, which is the event-driven architecture, rather, or maybe event-driven publisher and subscriber mode. So as you can see here, you can read this slide from left to right. You can see here the external system which is triggering events. That event is being consumed by Azure Service Bus, and then messages are being sent to Logic app. The broker is playing a role to send a payload or a messages to FNO. At the same time, service bus is also sending events to the FNO. Okay, that is also happening parallel in this architecture when there is a publisher is involved and more than one or two publishers and subscribers are involved. In terms of more detail in this architecture, as you can see here, it's a asynchronous mode in terms of data to be exchanged, and it's near to real time. The broker message, the routing message that is being used through the broker ESBs and frequencies event based, which you can easily compare with the previous slide, the talk that we had, where the frequency was either manually or maybe triggered by on a schedule basis. But in this context of publisher and the subscriber mode, your frequency is set up as event based, trigger is also happening on event based. However, the volume is is a medium, right? And data mapping, you can see here, you can go with non-canonical model. In terms of error handling, what we just talked about in the previous slide, that the reconciliation is also playing a important role here, right? So you can see here the logic app and the ESB. So think about a scenario where the external system is sending the information. So as we have seen that this is a last strategy of deep dive, where we talked about more on the event driven and the publisher and subscriber architecture patterns, right? Now we are reaching out to last slide. So thank you very much for giving me opportunity to talk here, and thank you Dynamics Con. Really privilege and honor to be part of this year 2022 Dynamics Con sessions, and thank you very much. Thanks once again.
Hi everyone, this is Rakesh. Any specific question on the slides and the explanation that I had given? I can see there are a couple of questions in the chat. One was from Dr. Ludwig and the other one was from Darshan. So Darshan, if you can just elaborate more on the last question that you highlighted, where I recommend to use the Power Automate for the scenario that you mentioned, but I think you did mention what is the technology. If you can just quickly highlight to me, maybe I'll be happy to help you here, Darshan. Okay, so I'll just quickly take one question, which is from Zahir. Is Microsoft moving to dual write and the Dataverse as a middleware of choice or best practice? I see a lot of recommendation for this. So, Zahir, if I just go back and try to reiterate the dual write, the purpose of dual write to build the CRM and the ERP piece together. So there are a bunch of use cases that I have personally seen with my customers where they're trying to bring the data up between CRM and the ERP. That is where the dual write comes into picture. However, there are other bunch of business use cases, Jahir, where dual write does not support out of the box capability, and that is where either you want to go with some sort of SOA sort of architecture where you can leverage logic apps, Azure logic apps, or maybe for that matter, Power Automate. Again, it is case by case. But to answer your question correctly, if there is out of the box entity to be refreshed within the CRM boundary, outside the boundary of CRM or the FNO, I think then they will write. Again, it's a cost effective solution where there is no license cost involved. There is one more question I can see from Giovanni, where is it possible to have another scenario example about Deep Dive 5, which is event-driven publisher and subscribers? Definitely, Giovanni, I can give you more detail, but again, in the interest of time of 40 minutes of session, I could able to just quickly highlight. But I think you can connect with me on my LinkedIn channel. We can have a deep dive more, and I'll happy to help you here. I can see one more question from Karen. Karen is saying we will be integrating inventory movements with an external warehouse soon. but don't know yet their specification. This has been helpful. Yes, Karen, the bunch of strategy, and specifically if you talk about a strategy of 5, which actually gives you the idea behind the event driven, which is work on a publisher and subscriber. In a nutshell, we call it as pub-sub model, but assume a fact that inventory is a large amount of data set, right? So I think that strategy 5 probably would help. Again, it's a tailor-made approach. Probably you can go for it out of the the information that you do have. Okay, I'll take two more questions. There is a one more question from. Um, Okay, there's a one more question from Darge. He's saying, from my understanding and experience, the OData web services calls performance can be slow, especially if multiple calls needed to be executed in a sync scenario. This can be a couple of seconds. Now, how do you deal with this? So data, first of all, OData is open data protocol, which allows you to build a integration in a synchronous pattern. And when it comes to synchronous patterns, there is a need to limit that data to be synchronized across the applications in a one go. Okay, so it allows you to 10,000 records in a per ball. However, you can define the paging, which will allow you to drastically reduce your performance over the web services call, and you will not face any challenges in terms of the slowness of the system. It's again up to how we are going to design that integration pattern. But if you go for synchronous, then I think OData is the best one. I can take one more question from Dr. Ludwig, where do you know anyone using the ER as an integration in production? So I'll give a couple of examples. The ER, the way it has been evolving as we speak, is more focused on business documents where business users, can try to extract the data immediately from the products rather than writing a piece of code. However, the ER is not there in terms of all the best practices to be required as an integration platform, because it requires some sort of scalability. It requires the more compute power when there is a lot of transaction to be happen. But I think in near future, ER can be a best tool, just to drag and drop and build the reporting sort of capability and extract data from the FNO world. However, as we speak, it does not support any sort of external capability where you can extract the data outside the boundary of any file, whether it's text and everything. I think that's all for now. Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Dynamics Con team, for giving me opportunity this year to speak.